Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. This is the week 4 recorded lecture for chapters 5 and 6 for EDCO 593. What I'll try to do is get through this quickly so that on my end I don't experience the same type of technical difficulties that I did last week. But yeah, let's see what we can do. The hope is that you will have already have read chapters 5 and 6. I hope that you did that once it was posted, as far as this was the expectation going back to Monday. Actually, it goes back to last week for these particular chapters, because originally this is where I was going to pick up next week. I'm sorry, last week, but I doubled back and made sure that you had what I thought were important points for chapters 1 through 4, specifically 2 through 4. And so now this week we'll focus on chapters 5 and 6. The hope is that after next week, where we deal with chapters 7 and 8, we'll be into more modern school counseling concepts, ideas, and concerns. So this is almost to the point of us dealing with the more historical aspect of things. So let's get to it. Chapter 5 deals with American education from 1812 to 1865. So as of last week, our conversation or your readings stopped right at the point where the United States was forming. We talked about the fact that, there were some things that the country was trying to emulate from things that were taking place in their respective mother countries in Europe. And so as we progress through these next few slides, you'll see that there's still some components that'll be adopted from practices in Europe, but there's a uniqueness that will exist again in the formulation or the formation of what will become the United States. So here's Horace Mann. He's referenced and has been referenced on several occasions as far as the readings are concerned. It's just as stated, he's an early advocate for universal public education. Timeline. This is coming directly from chapter 5. There's some key events that I hope you read about. Just as it stated there, it says before the War of 1812, education was virtually a religious enterprise. So again, I think it's been discussed and determined that it was very elite. It was very much something that was for the privileged, and it wasn't something that was for the masses. But after 1812, there were some things that were happening that I think it's important to keep in mind. Obviously, the issue of independence, but also what was happening was expansion. You may have heard of westward expansion and the Louisiana Purchase and all of those sorts of things. So what I like to tell people is that, just as I stated last time, with education being a microcosm of society and vice versa, society being a reflection of what's happening in education, you have to keep the background in mind. So we'll be more specific about that. But again, you have to keep in mind that the country was growing. It was growing from the 13 colonies, which, as we stated last week, there were some differences that existed between southern colonies and middle colonies and New England colonies. So even within that 13 colony, eventually would become states, there were fundamental differences in the way that things were being done. In the discussion, some of you have responded, some of you have not yet responded, so I won't steal too much of that thunder. But there's some differences between two major groups as it relates to education, the Puritans and the Quakers. And what was not mentioned were the Unitarian, but they play a major role in the formation of education. But let's talk a little bit about this timeline. You see, in 1817, there was the establishment in Boston for a school of the deaf. If we stick up there in that same section, you'll see that in New York, there was a school for the blind about 15 or so years after that. And then you'll see maybe about 15 or so years after that in Boston, and these were the terms that were appropriate at the time, there was attempts to teach what they called the profoundly retarded. So what you can say is that these were the first attempts at special education. There were specialized demographics with particular issues, and there were educational attempts to address teaching these individuals with these unique conditions and situations. So that has been something that started to evolve over time. Going back to the left side, infant schools and this whole concept of starting with the children. And you look at Henry Bernard when he visited the Prussian schools. If you're unaware, Google Prussia and where that was and what it was. It was a country that existed in modern day Germany. And in a lot of regards, as far as education is concerned, they were on the cutting edge. I'm going to dip all the way over to the right where it talks about kindergartens. That is a German word. And if, as you read, it means the garden of children. And you view children as the plants and teachers as the gardeners. So with that concept, it's explicitly stated that, hey, in terms of education, if we start with the youth, the babies, the infant schools, we mold them as they grow. Again, a lot of times it was for the purpose, especially from the Puritan perspective, the purpose of them being literate so that they can read the Bible. But at the end of the day, this is about educating the youth. So that was a consideration. You have the University of Virginia that was founded in 1819, along with some other schools that started to evolve. Just as was stated a couple weeks ago, originally, Harvard was created for the purposes of religious reasons. But as society grew, you had these other institutions that were becoming um, more dispersed throughout, again, what had at this point become the United States. A lot of readings and a lot of writings. The origins of the Americans. High school became a thing in 1827. The education of man, which was looking more at the theory, became a thing. It looked at the formation of the first normal schools. If you're unaware, normal schools are where teachers were trained. So anytime you hear the concept or the word or the term normal school, understand that those were the training institutions or the educational institutions for teachers. And those were teachers that were in the common schools. Common schools are what eventually became public schools. Again, just look at the key word, common. That is for the common folk. Whereas education prior to common schools were for the elites, the future leaders, the future clergymen. So again, as society evolved, it became a situation to where the leaders felt as though it was in the benefit of society to create these institutions to educate the masses. Now, I use the term masses loosely because who they really wanted to educate were the white males in society. Again, not to steal the thunder of the Puritan versus Quaker conversation, but there were some fundamental differences in the view that the Quakers had as it relates to education when compared to the Puritans. And there's also differences as far as the Unitarians are concerned as well. But in some instances, you'll hear the textbook or you'll read where the textbook speaks of educating the masses or all of the population, but that's the same vein of the Constitution stating all men are created equal, but they really don't mean all. Again, the backdrop is what's happening in society along the way. When we get to the next chapter, I'll speak a bit more about societal changes, When we talk about westward expansion, those are some things that need to be considered. But to the far right, you'll see where land grants became a thing, in which they were basically saying, hey, states will give you land for you to build these educational institutions, common schools, and a lot of times it was higher education. Again, later on, we'll talk about when it became an issue for certain segments of the population. But the land grant idea was the federal government's way of saying, hey, we value this thing called education, and here's our contribution. And in some instances, it was a bit more. In some instances, it was just that. At the end of the day, this was a way for the government to say, here's what we want to start doing. We're going to leave it up to the states and the local government to worry about the day-to-day ins and outs. But as a federal government, again, this is an evolving government. It was just formulating after independence. These are the efforts that they were attempting in time. The Common School Ideal, you can read that. This is coming straight from the textbook. What is a Prussian school? A Prussian school, you can read that. Robert Owen, Pioneering Childhood Education. The image in the center represents the Industrial Revolution. My face is covering the second image, but on the other upload of the actual presentation, you'll see it. But backdrop, technological advances in society, the shift from an agricultural society to now of a manufacturing society and a consumer-based society. Talked about the public school support in New York is where they pioneered the idea of using taxation to fund schools. Obviously, you're opening up these institutions to more people, common folk, and so you're looking at ways, the government is looking at ways to sustain and pay for these, since they were becoming less privatized, a little less exclusive in the scheme of things in comparison to what they had been in years prior to that. Nationalization. Many immigrants had customs and languages different from those of native-born populations. Therefore, the schools became a major instrument in the transfer of the American culture to the foreigners. This is an interesting topic. If you look at the map, westward expansion, Northwest Territory started in the late 1700s. Louisiana purchased when they acquired more land. In the 1800s, Texas was eventually acquired. Won from Mexico. I don't like that term won, but this is from the perspective of historians. And the Oregon Territory, again, concepts or things that occurred in the mid 1800s. The reason I bring that up after reading the paragraph on nationalization is it's ironic that they speak of foreigners when at this point in our lives we should know that America was occupied prior to the colonists coming here. And with westward expansion, it was displacing those who were here prior to them being here, let alone expanding. But this concept of nationalization is something that's very interesting. And I think the book only talks about it for a paragraph or two. Let's take a look at some of these images. The images, the angelic image is related to manifestation destiny, right? In which individuals believe it was ordained by God for there to be expansion of the United States. And anything that occurred in the process was okay, because this is our destiny as indicated in Scripture or as indicated in Word. So the images represent French-American War, represents the utilization of Native Americans in the expansion efforts, represents these what they would consider at the time immigrants coming to what was now America, and part of their nationalization was for them to be recruited in a lot of instances to assist with, again, the efforts of westward expansion. I'm going to recommend a chapter in the People's History textbook after we get through this, but it takes a different spin. Just as chapter 1 took a different spin on Columbus and how historically we're taught to view things a certain way, a very Eurocentric way. I think the author does a great job, and I use that term loosely, of continuing to view what happened with westward expansion in a very Eurocentric way. But again, we should know, you should know, that Texas was inhabited by people before it became part of the United States. The land that states that it was won from Mexico was inhabited by Mexicans prior to it being won from Mexico. Oregon Territory. Again, all of these eventual United States or states within the United States were occupied and individuals were displaced. And one of you had mentioned it, Indian schools or concentration camps is really what they were, became a thing. Even though the book didn't talk about it, we can talk about missions that existed throughout the Western and Texas region. But these are all, in my opinion, examples of depictions in history that, for the purposes of American education, have been sugar-coated. But I digress. Let's continue. I just wanted you to keep in mind that these are the things that we have to consider as we talk about the backdrop of specifically the formation of the American educational system. This talks about higher education before the Civil War. The Civil War was a pivotal moment. We'll get to that point in just a second. So it talked about how the birthplace of public higher education being in Georgia. You read the paragraph, it talks about how public higher education expanded. A lot of your institutions of education in what we now call K-12 and higher ed originate in the New England colonies, New England states. But it was when there were leaders such as Thomas Jefferson, who were typically Northerners, and in their attempt to educate the masses, the society, the nation, for democratic purposes, to help sustain this thing that was being built, they felt it was absolutely necessary to spread some of that knowledge wealth into the southern states. So this is where you saw an expansion of higher education into the South. Speaks more about technical schools, speaks more about educating the adults of society, speaks about cultural improvement. So when they mentioned the Indian schools, it was to relearn or have them relearn their culture so that they can become, quote unquote, more American or assimilate into American society. The technical school component is a big deal, and you'll figure that out next week, the next 2 weeks. Technical can be swapped out for vocational. There was a couple of things at play. The Industrial Revolution called for more of society to be trained in usage of these technological advances. How did that happen? Through the use of technical schools. How did they want to further the advances that society was making via the Industrial Revolution? Through technical schools or vocational schools. Again, with the shift from agricultural to a now manufactured base or more automated automated agricultural base, it was becoming important to train a workforce. And a lot of that training took place in technical schools. Now, mind you, this was before the Civil War. This becomes important again because there are some key things that occur after the Civil War that further the need for technical slash vocational schools and training of individuals in what was now becoming a growing middle class of society. This is more information on the Morrill Act or land grants, and you can see how schools, universities, public universities, were starting to spread throughout specific regions of the United States. You'll see number 7 is the University of California, first public higher education institution in California, Cal Berkeley. Interesting fact. Second, UCLA. You can go down this whole rabbit hole of the order of public higher education institutions in California. It's pretty interesting, but I'll spare you those details. But as you'll see, the disbursement reflected the population. There was more concentrated schools and institutions in the areas that were more concentrated in terms of the population, but because of the expansion, it called for institutions to be established in these other eventual states of the Union. Spoke of the growth of the academies. Common schools grew and normal schools grew. Obviously, if common schools were growing, the need for individuals to teach would also grow. So the book talks about the formalization of organizations and agencies that wanted to standardize the practice of educating teachers. These are the times in which you started to first see associations affiliated with the training and the practice and the use of the term pedagogy and the science of teaching and the science of learning, and all of these things started to occur with the expansion. I think it's fair to say that when there were the more exclusive individuals of society, they didn't see the types of situations and conditions that existed, whereas when they opened up the doors in common schools, it opened up the doors, figuratively speaking, for more educational issues. Again, this is with the evolution over time as far as society is concerned. The book basically gives minority education maybe 3-4 paragraphs. But as I stated, these are the things that are important for us to keep in mind because we know that, or we should know, that minorities at the time were probably a majority of the population. But for census purposes, and because once upon a time, uh, about 1 million inhabitants of the United States were considered property, um, they probably weren't considered as a factor as it relates to education. The book talks about assimilation and desegregation. Doesn't do a good job. It doesn't do the justice that that conversation deserves. But for the purposes of what we're doing and trying to establish this context of eventually school counselors and school psychologists, just know that those things are considerations as far as what's happening in the background with the American school system. It'll become more of the conversation as we get closer to modern times, especially as we are looking at the civil rights era. Land grants also were a thing for Black educational institutions, what we now refer to as HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. specifically as we got closer to the end of the Civil War, which is marked by the abolishment of slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation, in which 1 million individuals, or close to 1 million individuals, went from free labor, slaves, to now being part of, in theory, the population. And the thought process from leaders was, yes, they deserve an education, but not in our institutions. So you know what? Here's some land for you to establish your own institutions. The textbook talks about how there was no federal money behind that, and a lot of times the institutions were built by philanthropists, church organizations, or those that had the means to create, at this point, their own institutions. So they provided the land, and if you know a little bit of history about HBCUs, many of those campuses are actual plantations or former plantations where a lot of these former slaves resided. And when it became illegal, the owners of those plantations, and I'm pretty sure there were backroom deals that were made, swapped out. Here, take the land. It's useless to me. I'll figure out something else, but federal government is giving me cut rate, whatever the case may be, for the establishment of, at one point, what they call Negro schools. So again, the map shows how those schools were exclusively concentrated in areas in which slavery was prevalent, and then they creep up north to where there was a more liberal view of education. Chapter 6 deals with American education from 1865 to 1918. This is a key figure in African American history, W.E.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois as some people say. You can indicate, or you can see what his quotes were, and we can get into some of his contributions, but he was a proponent of education and equality, and in some instances assimilation, because he felt as though, rightfully so, it was the human right of, just as the Constitution states, all men. Timeline: 1865, monumental moment was the abolishing of slavery. There's some other things that are connected to that, the 14th and 15th Amendment. You'll see that in 1870, 28 cities instituted this idea of superintendents that were responsible for overseeing educational system. You'll see where it talks about special ed programs formally beginning in Rhode Island in 1893. You'll see this concept of junior highs taking place in California, junior colleges becoming a thing in California. You'll see in 1914, there was a Smith-Lever Act that encouraged agriculture. I like to say that that's probably related to the fact that a large portion of the workers, the slaves, that were doing the agricultural work for individuals are no longer legally bonded to having to do that. And so just like in modern days with all of the scares of mass deportations and ICE raids, how there are farmers that will play the victim of, I have no workers and this, that, or whatever. Now they are having to learn or find alternative means. And as we look at American history, that was the case in 1914. In 1917, there was the Smith-Hughes Act, which encouraged vocational schools, technical schools, vocational schools, interchangeable. Again, this is about the connection to the Industrial Revolution and the need for a more skilled labor force as it relates to the population. Two key individuals, Thorndike and Dewey. Once I'm done with this conversation, I am going to provide you with some links to some videos that specifically talk about Thorndike. They specifically talk about Dewey, and they specifically do a comparison between the two so that you can see the direction that American schools would take as a result of these two gentlemen's theories in the late 19 teens. Stimulus for change in education, the Southern collapse, African Americans, all factors as it relates to what was happening in America after the Civil War. National affairs and progress, industrial exploitation, agriculture, population and vocation changes. Again, technology, the creation of factories, a lot of the advances that were occurring in society shaped what needed to happen and what would eventually happen in the school settings. So these are all things that are mentioned in chapter 6. Last slide. 6.2 shows the growth of normal schools from 1875 being less than 100 to about 25 years later to there being about 350 schools to train teachers. Other information, other pieces of information you can read on your own. But as I stated, the next step is for you to check out these two videos that speak specifically on Dewey and Thorndike. In terms of recorded lectures, I will see you next week where we will be going over chapters 7 and 8. All right.